All right. Good morning to everyone who is joining us. Welcome to the release webinar. We do this, of course, once a quarter, and this is time for the next one. So thank you to everyone for joining us. We are, of course, live streaming this on YouTube. We are also recording, so there will be a recording of this webinar made available afterwards. So if you aren't able to pay close attention or you want to share this with your colleagues and friends afterwards, don't worry. We will be posting a link to the whole thing shortly after we wrap up today, which is great. How do I keep moving? There we go. So this is, of course, the release webinar for HAPI FHIR 5.3.0, as well as Smile CDR 2021-02 R01. We've codenamed this release Odyssey, and I'm going to talk about the name a little bit later and a little tie-in that we've got there. So let's dive into what we're going to talk about today. As always, our agenda is going to cover what is new in the product. We're going to talk a little bit about what's coming up, and we've got a Q&A session lined up to complete things. We have a really packed set of new features this time around. I'm really excited to sort of talk through all of them. This feels like, in a lot of ways, I feel like this feels like a new style of release. Obviously, as a company, we are continuing to get bigger and more organized, and sort of our processes are solidifying. And I will say, among other things, we had this release has gone through just a staggering amount of QA compared to previous releases. We've always, of course, QA'd our releases. That's a normal part of software development. But the amount of sort of going through and retesting everything that's gone in shortly before release, just to make sure that everything worked the way it was supposed to, just feels like a new process. So we've put a ton of work into solid release engineering processes over this last release, and I think a lot of that is going to shine through in terms of feature stability and sort of organized cohesiveness of what's gone into this release. I'm super excited for all of that. So let's dive into what's brand new and what's been added as a part of the Odyssey release. First off, we have been working, of course, for a few releases now on a feature called the EMPI. EMPIs, to anyone who is not familiar, of course, are all around people matching. They're all around sort of taking streams of, for example, patient data and identifying if two records actually refer to the same physical person because they have similar demographics. A huge change that's gone into this release is our EMPI module has been renamed from EMPI to MDM, which stands for Master Data Management. The reason we made that change is we have really blown up the scope of what this module is about. It's no longer about person matching at all. In fact, person matching is still covered, but that's only one sort of subset use case. The MDM module is all about finding duplicate records of any type. And in fact, the MDM module will now match any resource type at all in the FHIR database. So if you're looking to identify duplicate allergy assessments or duplicate drug orders or duplicate lab results, any of those would be candidates for MDM, and certainly could be integrated into this system and could be searched for using the MDM matching logic that is a part of this module. On top of that, we have implemented over the last quarter support for what's called golden resource and survivorship rules, which is effectively the ability to create a golden resource, which has your sort of best known, I guess you'd call them best known demographics if we're talking about people, but certainly these don't have to be demographic attributes at all. And then survivorship rules, which is kind of a neat term, and ultimately sort of boils down to how do we determine what data information changes and what do we not accept from various sources of data. A very fancy sort of set of code. A massive shout out, of course, to Nick Grupinetz, who's a relatively newcomer to Smile CDR and has put tons and tons of work into this. Way to go, Nick. We totally love what you've been doing with MDM the last while. Next up, I've spoken about this a few times as something that was coming up, and it's finally starting to deliver results, which is awesome. We have been working to integrate what's called the clinical quality language, more commonly known as CQL, support into HAPI FHIR and Smile CDR. This is being done through an amazing sort of collaboration and partnership with a couple of organizations, notably our partners IntraHealth and Digital Square, who are funding some of the work that we're doing, and an amazing collaboration with a company called Alphora, who are, among other things, really the leads who are implementing much of the reference technology for the CQL language, and frankly spearheading the creation of the language itself. So absolutely amazing partnership with some really inspiring people, which is awesome. What has happened in the last quarter is we have successfully integrated support for the CQL evaluate measure operation, which is one of the primary operations. Certainly not the only operation in the CQL space, but one of the most important ones. All of that has been integrated into both products. It is available through the HAPI FHIR Starter, as well as through the current release of Smile. And we are beginning to sort of see all of this integration pay dividends in terms of performance. There is a ton of performance work that has happened already and a ton to come still that improves the performance of evaluating CQL expressions across data. There are some really interesting use cases for CQL that we've got in mind. So exciting times for anyone who is looking to do decision support or analytics against giant bodies of FHIR data. And there we go. Another feature that has proved really popular already, despite barely making it into the product for any length of time, is something called repository validation mode. We've always had the ability to do validation, or at least it's been a long time since we added validation capabilities to HAPI FHIR and Smile. You've always had the ability to sort of say, I want to validate resources and perhaps have rules around what happens when they fail. What we have not had is this ability in a FHIR repository to set declarative rules that say, I require all data that goes into my repository to conform to specific profiles. So for example, if you're building a repository that should always conform to US core profiles, you can now declare that that is the case, and the system will apply those rules. It will check conformance against specific IG profiles and reject data that doesn't conform. This is incredibly useful for all kinds of reasons. Notably, it happens deep inside the code base, not just at the HTTP sort of REST layer, which means that the system is able to look at data being updated by FHIR transactions, as well as data being updated by patches. Even internal Java API calls go through repository validation mode. So incredibly powerful feature for validation, and very, very timely. We're seeing pretty quick uptake already of this feature, which is awesome. Next up, a major sort of architectural change that has happened in the product is an upgrade from the old Hibernate Search 5 to the new Hibernate Search 6. This is something we've wanted to do for a long time, but of course, Hibernate Search 6 has been in beta for a long time, and we've always been cautious about putting a beta library into a production-grade product. Fortunately, that beta period ended. This is awesome news for anyone who is taking advantage of Elasticsearch support. What this means is that up until now, we've been limited to supporting Elasticsearch 5. And Elasticsearch 5 is really ancient in the world of Elasticsearch. In fact, it had a couple of disclosed CVE vulnerabilities, and it was really causing headaches for people trying to use it. We now support Elasticsearch 6 and 7 through this change. And most notably, we like this change enough, and we like the new features in newer versions of Elasticsearch enough that we have decided to deprecate the use of raw leucine. Doesn't mean that support is completely going away, but we are now taking the stance that if you're doing production deployments that are intending to achieve scalability and high volume, we effectively do not recommend using raw leucine anymore. We're recommending move to Elasticsearch. It is worth mentioning if you're upgrading. If you're using Elasticsearch or Leucine and you're upgrading, you are required to do a resource reindex so that your Elasticsearch database will get seeded. That is a part of upgrading, and we're happy to chat about what that means. I do stress, of course, you're not required to use Elasticsearch at all. There are a couple of features in the repository that use it, and if you're not using those features, you have no need to use Elasticsearch at all. So don't worry. If you're not using Elasticsearch or Leucine today, you don't need to start as of this release. But if you are, this means you can use a newer and more powerful version of it, which is great. Apparently, I've got 2 slides talking about repository validation mode, so I will skip the second one. Normalized quantity searches. This is another really interesting feature that came out of a partnership that we have had going for quite some time with the NIH, who are really pushing the boundaries of what a FHIR server can be. Normalized quantity searches, which is an idea that came straight from them, is this new mode that allows you to take any data that has been codified using UCUM codes. So UCUM, the unified codes for units of measure, provides standardized coding for units such as liters, as I've got as an example on my screen. And this means that if I've got a quantity, I've got, for example, an observation resource that has been saved with a quantity of 2 liters, you can now do a search for greater than 1,000 milliliters, and that search will match because the search indexes will store a normalized version of those quantities. So this of course is incredibly powerful if you've got sort of heterogeneous sources of data that don't always use consistent units. I think normalized quantity searches will be very popular for that. I don't mention it here on the slide, but there's a little bit of rigmarole around adding this. It is not enabled by default because, of course, normalizing has implications and actually has some implications on how much space your indexing takes. So it is something you have to explicitly enable. Happy to chat about the implications of that as needed afterwards. We have made a few enhancements to the way we do builds. We're sort of continuing talking about plumbing a little bit. I will mention HAPI FHIR has been tested and built against JDK 11 for a long time. We've had a couple of dependencies that prevented us from moving beyond JDK 11. Notably, in fact, all of our testing for Elasticsearch, there were some infrastructural reasons we couldn't move beyond that, but those have all been fixed over the last quarter. So we're now actually doing all of our building and testing on OpenJDK 15 for HAPI FHIR. We're not dropping support for Java 8. Don't worry, if you're still using Java 8, that remains, and we have no plans to move off of Java 8 for supported JDKs. But this does mean that if you're intending to try and stay more current with your JDKs, I'm hoping we're in a position now where HAPI will just consistently work with the latest and greatest versions of the JDK as well, which I think is great for anyone who wants to continue to see where that language is evolving. Another thing that's happened in terms of build enhancements, which is almost entirely invisible to anyone using the library, but is incredibly, is great that it's happening, is we have finally moved to automated vulnerability scans of everything we ship. We were doing these periodically before, but we're now doing it completely automatically. And the system that ships our builds and pushes them up to Docker servers and Maven repositories and things like that, will automatically run the build through an OWASP CVV checker that looks for any vulnerabilities in any of the libraries we're using. We've got its threshold actually tuned very, I guess I'll say it's tuned very high, meaning that we'll flag anything that has a severity above low. So we've got it very sensitive in terms of its flagging, and have been very diligently watching since we turned this on. It has already actually caught a couple of libraries that had vulnerabilities, and we have quickly dealt with those things. So there we go. Another interesting feature, and this is really coming out of our extensive work with US payers these days, is this feature called auto version references. So what this is about is if you've got resources with a reference from one resource to another, and the example that I'll use, and this is actually the use case that prompted the creation of this feature. If I'm storing explanation of benefit resources in my repository and they've got a subject link to an individual patient, often for that type of data, it's really useful to understand which version of the patient was current when you created the EOB, because of course that will represent the demographics and the other information that would actually appear on the physical EOB as it was. So you want those things to line up. So with this feature enabled, you can actually configure HAPI and Smile to automatically insert the current version to that reference, meaning you don't need to manually do that. The system will just automatically figure out what's appropriate, and it will insert that into the versioning for that reference. This is doubly useful because it means if you're doing your updates and inserts through FHIR transactions or Java API calls or anything else, that insertion will still always happen, and it will reflect the current state as of the end of the transaction or whatever your thing is. Additionally, we've got configuration built into the system now, which means that _ includes will actually respect those version references if enabled to do so. So if you're bringing back give me all my EOBs, and also include the the subject that comes in, if those are using version references, you'll actually get the appropriate version of the subject back for your underscore include. Super useful for people who need this. I suspect there are applications for this that go well beyond EOBs and US payers, but this has been quite popular with that group at least already. Another enhancement, we added support for partitioned repositories 2 releases ago and have continued to enhance that as we go. The thing that's been added as of this release is support for searching across multiple partitions. Since the start of this feature, we've had the ability for you to specify a search would go against either one partition or against all partitions. Those 2 options remain, but we've now got another where you can search across 2 or 3 or 4 specific partitions. So if you're using partitions for some sort of really complicated setup, you've now got the ability to, you've got more tools in your tool belt, I guess I should say, to take advantage of partitioning to do fancy spanning searches. Also worth mentioning, the JPA Server Starter project. So HAPI FHIR users who are using the JPA repository mode now have, well, the JPA Server Starter has existed for some time. One of the things that happened a few months ago is through a really great contribution, and we thank very much Jens Valadsen, who did most of the work in terms of getting this off the ground. The JPA Server Starter has been completely reworked as a native Spring Boot application, meaning that anyone who's familiar with Spring Boot understands how to set it up and configure it and that type of thing. The Starter is just a textbook Spring Boot application now, so all of your configuration goes into a standard YAML file, and you can set up profiles and all the good stuff that you can do with Spring Boot. This certainly eases deployment of that application as well. So thank you very much, Jens. I think it's awesome, awesome the way this project works now, and we've heard loads of good feedback in terms of this change, so that's great. The FHIR Gateway. Where do we even start with the FHIR Gateway? Smile has had a module called FHIR Gateway for ages. It has been very lightly used, truthfully. It hasn't been a very popular module, and I suspect the main reason for that has been its limitation, which is quite significant. The gateway has always been a one-to-one gateway, where it acts effectively as a reverse proxy against a FHIR server, but only against one FHIR server. So one of the things we've done over the course of the last quarter is to completely rewrite the gateway module so that it's no longer bound to a single server. It now can proxy multiple FHIR servers. It's got the ability, for example, to take a FHIR search and broadcast that FHIR search out to 5 different FHIR servers, aggregate the results, and then return a result to your FHIR client that makes those 5 FHIR servers look as though they were a single FHIR server. We've got some pretty interesting routing logic built into this. There's an interceptor framework built into the gateway now that allows custom logic and custom routing to be implemented via interceptors. So loads of great sort of potential in the new FHIR Gateway module. I will mention the gateway for now is read-only. That was not the case with the previous iteration of the FHIR Gateway. But because of the rewrite, we have not yet implemented support for write operations. It's only got support for read operations. But don't worry, if you're using the gateway for write operations, we will be implementing that in short order as well. We just hadn't quite gotten there by the time we reached this release. We would love to hear feedback. The gateway it's an interesting module in that it's so flexible and there are so many things you can do with it that we really have no idea how many different things it's going to get used for. And there probably are gaps in its functionality that we just didn't think of because we had no idea of your use case. So we would love to hear from you if you're intending to use the gateway for something. CDS hooks, another amazing feature that's gone into Smile over the last quarter is a brand new module that brings support for CDS hooks. Effectively, and I'm really barely going to be able to do justice for this. I've got a slide here, of course, that's showing the textbook Hello World CDS hooks application and a few use cases for how you might take advantage of CDS hooks as a standard. Naturally, with especially all of the work that's going on in the US around sort of moves to value-based care and HIE integration and stuff like that. There are a bunch of great use cases for CDS hooks, and certainly this does not extend only to the US. There are many great global uses for this technology. The CDS hooks module that has been added to HAPI FHIR effectively brings, it's sort of a methodology that looks a little bit like the HAPI FHIR plain server resource provider model, where you create some POJO classes, you give them some special annotations that are a part of the framework, and the framework does all of the hard work then. It does all of the plumbing to take what you've written and turn it into a full-blown CDS hooks support server that will implement your services and make them available to consumers of CDS hooks servers. Loads more to say about this. Don't have time to do it today, but I would highly recommend checking out the documentation, which does have loads of great information and a starter project for getting going with CDS hooks as a feature. Way to go, Ken, by the way, on that. Ken did tons of work on this, and in fact, spent a whole bunch of time at the most recent FHIR Connectathon getting this all tested against various trading partners that support CDS hooks. So awesome work there. MongoDB, we continue to chug along in our in adding support for various features with our MongoDB repository. This time around, what we've added is support for paging of large queries. So if you do searches that return tons of data, we're now we've got a sort of a native solution for paging now that is much more scalable and works, frankly, way better than this worked in previous releases, as well as a bunch of new search prefixes. Of course, the FHIR spec itself is such a boundless spec. There are so many little corner cases in things like the search specification that, of course, you always realize there's specific prefixes and modifiers and things you didn't support. So we've gone through and added quite a bit of what was missing there in terms of support for MongoDB. Probably more to come on this in the next quarter as well. We're still got a bunch of in-flight work going on around the way that we store data. So that is great. One other feature I want to sort of draw your attention to in this release is a thing called the Resource Builder, and specifically a class called the FHIR Path Resource Generator R4. This was a community contribution, and we thank Marcel P for this contribution. Thank you so much, Marcel. This is still an experimental module. I think we'll still be iterating over this in the next while. But what this class allows you to do is construct a resource using purely FHIR path expressions. So effectively, you can say, I want this piece of information to go at this FHIR path expression and this piece of information to go at this other FHIR path expression, meaning that you can effectively just have a key value pair map of what your data should look like, and the resource builder will take care of populating a resource instance for you. If that doesn't sound exciting to you, you probably are just not getting what I'm saying, and it's a tough thing to sort of explain, but trust me, this is going to be really neat for people who are trying to build data in sort of a version agnostic way, which is cool. A few enhancements have gone into our channel import module. Reminder, of course, channel import is all about you publishing FHIR data, initially FHIR data, to a channel, meaning a JMS topic, or sorry, a JMS queue or a Kafka stream. We've now got ability for that data to not be FHIR resources. You can put CSV data onto your channel or arbitrary JSON payloads onto your channel. And we've got a mapping API built into channel import now that allows you to build up mappings that will transform that data into FHIR and ultimately store it in your repository. Very popular feature with people who are trying to process real-time feeds of data into a repository for whatever reason. So this channel import continues to grow and continues to get more powerful with every release. I mentioned last time around that we had rewritten the search builder, which is the module which generates SQL for FHIR searches, into a new module that is much more efficient than the previous iteration. That version was around but not enabled by default in the previous release of Smile. It is now enabled by default. So Smile users will get, after tons of testing on our side, Smile users will get the benefit of this amazing new SQL generator that really does generate much more efficient searches for certain types of certain patterns of querying, I guess I should say. Finally, in terms of what's new, I have really only scratched the surface. I'm looking at the clock and I'm exactly where I wanted to be in terms of time, which is awesome. But there was a lot that I did not have a chance to talk about. So I will encourage you to check the change logs. I did notice this morning, unfortunately, the change logs are formatted a little bit weirdly on the live website, and I kicked off a CI job to fix that about an hour ago, but it has not yet quite completed. So the change logs are a little bit strangely organized on the live site right this second. Give us about an hour, and they'll be back to normal. So there we go. So what are we working on in the next quarter? I will quickly say that a lot of our focus, of course, these days, not by any means all of our focus, but a major bit of our focus, of course, is around helping people get up and live for the CMS final rule, which is, of course, mandating a bunch of patient accessible APIs for data around the US payer market. That is causing all kinds of testing of various modules and features and the way that we import IGs and all of that stuff. And we continue to work with all kinds of people to take bug reports and make fixes. And a lot of this is stuff that will be useful well beyond just implementations in the US payer market. These are great fixes that are going in for really global enhancements. So this is well worth doing. But I will sort of mention to anyone wondering, it's likely that we will have an out of cycle release. So the next scheduled release, of course, is in May. The next one after that will be in August. We may add an extra release this time around, just because, of course, there are a number of people that have a July 1st go live cutoff. That's when the rules will start being enforced. And we do recognize that there may be changes that we need in order to have a stabilized production ready release that has last minute features and bug fixes in it. So we may end up doing that. We will see. Two little things that have changed that I will draw attention to anyone using HAPI FHIR. One, the HAPI FHIR repository has moved on GitHub. This is kind of an invisible change because GitHub will automatically redirect you from the old URL, but reviewers will notice that the HAPI FHIR project is now in the HAPI FHIR organization in GitHub. So that's our new URL for the project. I'll also mention we're changing the way that we number snapshot builds of HAPI FHIR. This doesn't affect Smile users at all, but HAPI FHIR snapshots are, we're adding a little prefix. This actually brings the way that we number HAPI FHIR a little bit more in line with the way that we do this with Smile CDR. We're going to be releasing pre-snapshots periodically, and we'll be bumping this not on any fixed schedule, but as changes come in that merit rolling that number, we'll be doing that. So there is a version live already in Maven Central labeled HAPI FHIR 5.4.0-pre1-snapshot. There is nothing new in that release yet that is not in 5.3.0, but as we continue to evolve the product, the library rather, we will be pushing more snapshots that do add things. So that's the way we're doing that. So in closing, before we get to QA, I will say lots of people, of course, are familiar with the HAPI FHIR raccoon. It's been a very popular sticker. Anyone that's ever come to visit us in Toronto, back when seeing each other face to face was a thing, we're lucky if they got away without a sticker. And in fact, most people were begging us for more so they could give them to friends and colleagues and get them on everyone's laptops and kids and stuff like that. Smile CDR has not had such a mascot up until now. So I'd like to introduce to everyone the Smile CDR adventurer, who doesn't yet have a name. As you can see, they're a little astronaut, and there's a whole rationale for that I'm not going to totally get into right this second because we don't have time to talk about it. Other than to say, I think there's a fun tie in there between the name Odyssey and our adventurer who has just been released. Our adventurer doesn't have a name yet, and we would like to give this person a name. So I will say, if you would like to visit smilecdr.com/adventurer, we would love to hear your suggestions on names. And we've got sticker packs that will be mailed out once this stuff has been finalized. Worth mentioning, the adventurer does not have a gender. They may never have a gender, they may get one. So feel free to give us names that suggest one way or the other, or genderless names, and we'll figure out what ends up happening there. In terms of that, so I'm trying really careful to call them they because I don't want to predetermine anything right now. Cool. So that's the astronaut. Final new thing, the Smile CDR User Symposium is coming. Our User Symposium is basically a way to connect with other people who are taking advantage of the platform, hear from people who are doing cool things. We've got a whole bunch of awesome sessions already lined up for this. If you're interested in joining, please do check out our website, smilecdr.com/symposium. to learn more about what's going on with the symposium. We would love to have you come and join us. And I cannot tell you, the agenda already looks amazing. We've got some really fascinating speakers lined up for this. So it's going to be a great time, I'm quite certain. So that is all I had to say. I'm going to turn my camera back on around the new release. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. I'm now going to ask two other people to come and join us. Those two people are, of course, Ken Stevens, who is our Director of Product Development for our core platform, and that includes both Smile CDR and HAPI FHIR. Ken, I'm sure anyone who's spent any time really on the HAPI FHIR mailing list has probably seen his name lots, and any Smile CDR customers who have had anything remotely complicated to ask of us have probably gotten into it with Ken as well. A name that this webinar may not be quite as familiar with, but probably will be as time goes, is Jason Bulgin. Jason has been with us for a while now as the product manager for our core platform, which also includes Smile CDR and HAPI FHIR. Welcome, Jason. So Jason is going to be moderating this session. So Jason, over to you.
Thanks, James. And so everyone, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and don't be shy. And in the meantime, we do have a question through our YouTube live stream, which is whether the FHIR Gateway is available for Smile CDR only.
Yeah, so I guess the short answer is yes. We do. It's always a tough decision for us. What features do we put into the open source products versus what features go into the commercial product? And it's a tough one. I mean, I am myself, of course, an open source junkie and a big believer in the power of open source. And in a perfect world, of course, everything would live in there, but we do, of course, have to find some way to feed ourselves. So this is one of those features that remains in the paid product. That may change in the future. We've had lots of features graduate from the commercial product to the open source product over time, and who knows what will happen in the future with this one. But yes, that is the way that works for now.
And unless my panel is not working, we have no questions.
Maybe it'll be a short Q&A today. I wonder. I mean, if we're waiting for a question to come in, one thing I might actually ask is, Ken, do you want to give us a better explanation of what's new in the world of MDM? I sort of quickly talked about it, but I feel like you'd do a better job explaining it than I would actually.
Yeah, I think you covered the main things. In the past, we were using a person resource to maintain the links, and now basically every resource has a copy, which is sort of the golden record in EMPI talk for that resource, and then other resources will get linked to golden resources as required, and that the tricky bit of that is deciding which data gets replicated into the golden resource and which doesn't. And so we have really a rich set of rules, and it's basically a JavaScript API that's really, I think quite beautifully designed, that has hierarchical rules for deciding what those survivorship rules should be. We're working with a couple of partners that are actively using it to make sure that it sort of is well designed for real life use cases.
All right, and we're starting to get some questions. So Bryn Rhodes asks, does the normalized quantity search use the same UCUM.java library to do the quantity conversions?
Yes, yeah. So thank you, Bryn, for that. Yeah, the normalized searches, we are using the open source UCUM library that lives I think under the HL7 organization. At least I think that's where it lives. That is the library we're using. Yes.
All right, we've got another one from Hawad. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, or it's just an email address. Want to know if the concepts under certain code systems and terminology module will support history, the same history, we're having on any FHIR resources.
Ooh, there's a fun question. So actually, yeah, we didn't even talk about it, as this is one of the things that ended up relegated to the change logs, and probably shouldn't have. Actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because really this probably should have made it into the actual webinar. One of the other things that has been added through our through partnership with Loink is support for versioned code systems in the terminology server. Of course, as a FHIR resource, you've always been able to create new versions of FHIR resources, but the terminology server, which did things like validating codes and expanding value sets and all of that good stuff, has always been non-versioned, meaning if you upload a new version of a code system, then that will override the previous version that was stored in the natively in the terminology server. That has changed now. We've got the ability for multiple versions of code systems to live in harmony next to each other inside the terminology server. So certainly, yes, if you are uploading multiple versions, they will all be stored. And when you do things like value set expansions and code validations and things like that, you can either not specify a version of the code system, in which case you'll be working against the most recent, or you can specify a version, in which case your operations will work against that specific version.
Great, and looks like the creative juices are flowing now. I've got a few more. So this is a nice one for Ken. You look like you're getting bored there. So the question is, can you describe more the MDM golden resource matching rules and MDM user interface to resolve matching or duplicates?
All right, so we do not currently have a user interface. That's something that is planned. The interface is we actually provide two different RESTful interfaces. One is as a FHIR operation, if you want to sort of do it strictly in the FHIR way, but those can be quite verbose. So in Smile CDR, there's also a much leaner, just straight, clean REST API for interacting with the links. There are quite a few operations. Anyone familiar with EMPI space? You have to resolve possible duplicates or possible matches to determine whether they're actual matches. So I think there's maybe 11 or 12 different operations that are supported right now. We do plan to, in the future, build a user interface for interacting with those links. But for now, there's just a RESTful interface.
Thanks. Next one is, will Smile CDR offer vulnerability certification or just conformance to a standard?
Huh, that's an interesting question. I guess ultimately, probably depends what's meant by that. I think this is probably one question I'm going to dodge, not because I don't want to answer it. It's actually a super interesting question, but I think there's so many possible angles in terms of what that might look like that I would love to sort of actually get into a one-on-one discussion about what you would want from us in terms of vulnerability certification. So I'd say we're very open to discussing it, but the specifics I don't really know what it would look like exactly.
Next one in the Q&A, and there's a few coming through the chat as well, from Zakai, is, where's a good place to start for newcomers to HAPI and Smile?
Ooh. So HAPI FHIR, I think the easiest thing, if you're a newcomer, I mean, I will say hapifhir.io is the website. The documentation links there. There is a ton of documentation on HAPI FHIR on the website. The specific things I always try and draw people's attention to is in the documentation for every section that is for a major feature. So the client library, the plain server library, the JPA server library, the validation library. There's a page in each of those labeled Get Started, and it's got a little lightning bolt in the name of the, even in the table of contents next to that page. Those pages will link you in every case to an actual working Java starter project that gives you working code you can check out and add to your IDE that acts as a client or a FHIR server or a database. So those are absolutely the places to get started. On the Smile world, we've actually got a tutorial in the Smile documentation that goes through all kinds of things, including setting up a FHIR repository, seeding it with data, connecting a Smart on FHIR app to it, and ultimately browsing the data using the Smart on FHIR app. So there is a full-on tutorial there that goes through all kinds of setup. That's probably your best bet for getting started with Smile.
Thanks, James. Another one is, are you planning on implementing observation-stats in HAPI FHIR or in Smile CDR?
Ooh, love it. So, I mean, I would absolutely say yes. I can't wait to get that operation implemented. In terms of timing, good question. Obviously, stats is it's a really tricky thing. I mean, if you think about the design of the repository is first and foremost designed for operational use cases. Like, it's designed to be used as an online transactional processing system. Meaning that, you know, our main aim in terms of performance is, you know, find me specific data that meets specific criteria and update that data if need be as quickly as possible. A database that's optimized for that is usually the exact opposite database design to what you might use for something that was organized about do population health queries, where I want to know what the average is for a specific reading over the last month for these 10 patients, which is the kind of thing the stats operation is designed for. That type of thing calls for a very different, really, architecture of data and architecture of system to be able to answer. Which doesn't mean we don't want to do it. We absolutely do, but it is a thing I think we need to think a fair bit about. What is the right approach for doing? I will say, I mean, things like the stats operation, this is one of the reasons I'm really excited we've moved on to a modern version of Elasticsearch. You will recall in our last release, we added support for the $last_n operation, which is another sort of little corner case of the observation spec, which is actually super useful if you've got those specific use cases in mind. And the only reason we were able to make last_n performant was because we took advantage of features that were in a brand new Elasticsearch, and we ended up in this really funky spot where you had to use 2 different versions of Elasticsearch to be effective if you wanted to do that. Those days are behind us now. Everything is supported with the modern Elasticsearch, and I think that does open up the door for us doing things like the stats operation as well.
Okay, and we've got 2 more that have shown up in the YouTube stream. So the first is, when do we expect to have feature parity between MongoDB storage module and the relational storage module? I know you love that question, James.
Yeah, these are great. I do honestly love this question. So feature parity, I guess, you know, the cheeky answer is never. There are certain things which may well never end up in the Mongo repository. I mean, I probably shouldn't say never, because it's not like there's anything that's impossible to do in the Mongo repository. But for example, things like the terminology service used for validation, it makes, truthfully, it's not really hugely worthwhile to get that into the Mongo repository. It's not like there's anything preventing it from working there, but the design that we've gone with really is that if you want to do terminology and you've got a Mongo repository, we've implemented this new feature. I think I showed it on a slide, but didn't actually speak to it in the presentation. That allows you to create a dedicated FHIR repository that's called a validation support repository, and you can pair that with your operational repository. So if you need terminology services as a part of your Mongo repository, you can create a little tiny relational repository that sits next to it, and the Mongo repository draws on that relational repository for its terminology services. That sort of means that we actually don't need to achieve feature parity in that regard with the Mongo database to get that type of support. That aside, I mean, most everything else that is in the Mongo repository, or that is in the relational repository, we do intend to get into the Mongo repository, and we are slowly narrowing the gap. It's worth pointing out there is a table that compares what's available in the 2 repositories that's available in the Smile CDR docs on the page for Mongo repository. There's a great big table that outlines every feature of FHIR we could think of and shows whether it's supported yet in Mongo, and we're getting closer and closer. I would say I don't have a specific date because it's diminishing returns, of course. The relational repository is a reference server, so it absolutely has to, because it's a reference server for the FHIR spec itself. The HAPI FHIR server it has to support every possible thing in the FHIR spec. But a lot of that is stuff that's really not useful to most repositories and most implementations, so it's not always worth putting the effort to getting that feature parity there. So I guess ultimately, I don't actually know when we'll get there. We're getting closer and closer. If there are specific features missing from Mongo that are useful for your implementation, we'd love to hear about it, because that sort of informs us what areas we should be focusing on next in terms of Mongo. And that's actually what drove the last 2 things we added is specific customer requirements.
Great. And the last one that I'm seeing, although we have about 10 minutes left, is again coming through YouTube from Irina Roy, which is around the gateway. So when we say it's read only, it doesn't mean it only works for queries. Can you use the gateway query and live bundle feature together? Will that work?
So the gateway support, as of right now in the redesigned gateway, we support the FHIR operations called read, vRead, and search. So those are the only three FHIR operations that we support. Notably absent from that are, of course, the write operations, things like create and update, as well as patch. None of those are supported through the new gateway yet. Also missing is support for any $ operations in FHIR, which actually does exclude the use of the gateway for live bundles as of right now. However, none of these are hard to implement truthfully. All of the plumbing has been done. It was just, the tail end of development didn't give us time to get that stuff into the gateway. I expect that we'll be closing that gap quite quickly. So I'd be confident in saying all of those things will be supported as of the next release, and certainly even pre-release builds before long should have that support as well.
All right. I am not seeing any other questions through any of the channels that I'm trying to monitor at once now. So if there are any, slap them into the Q&A here, and we'll hang on for another minute or so. One last question from Zikai. Coming in. It's trickling in here. Azure image. Smile CDR image. I'm not understanding the question yet. Azure image of this, sorry, Azure image Smile CDR image. Is there anyone using it?
So our support, yeah, I guess this is probably worth quickly talking about. We've been working very diligently with our friends at Microsoft to get Smile CDR listed in the Azure marketplace. There's a whole bunch of work that's gone on there, and I mean, obviously a massive thank you to everyone internally who's been working on that effort, both on the Smile side and on the Microsoft side. It's been a bunch of work to get that in. This was only added about a month ago, so I mean, I'll be totally blunt there. We do not have anyone using that Azure image in production yet. It's just too new of a feature for that to exist. So I guess the short answer is no, but we know there are quite a few people already kicking the tires. So obviously a deployment like that is something that takes a while to percolate, but there's also there are regulatory pushes that are making people work a little bit faster than they would otherwise. So I suspect the answer is going to shift from no to yes pretty quickly.
Right. I guess I'll leave the one more minute dangling there. It worked last time. We'll see what comes in. All right. I think that those who would have bit.
Sounds good. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We will see you again in 3 months, and we'll see you on YouTube between now and then. Thanks again. Bye-bye.